Sup everybody, welcome to the first episode of Apple Cider Monologues. So for today, my first ever book review, we have the 1987 contemporary Japanese novel, Norwegian Wood by Haruki Murakami. Now a lot of you may not be familiar with this book, and to be honest, it makes sense because Murakami is a Japanese writer, but he writes in such a Western sort of style that it'd be fairly easy to understand at times. So Norwegian Wood is about a boy named Toru Watanabe who just started college, and basically the whole book progresses through 4 years of his life in college. More specifically, it chronicles his relationship with Nayoko, the girlfriend of his best friend Kazuki, who actually committed suicide a few weeks before their graduation. So, full disclaimer, it does talk about suicide. There's also like a few sexual scenes in it. So if that is something uncomfortable or something you're not really interested in, then you can just skip this video. So I read this book like a few months ago, right? And I said to read it again for this video, and I have to say it gets better the second time around. And I'll admit, I don't really read a lot of books, but out of the ones I have read, this by far is probably my favorite and probably like the best one I've ever read. So what's interesting about this book is that in a lot of ways it speaks, I guess, to young teenagers or like young adolescents, which he starts college. So specifically for my age range, specifically for me, since I'm starting college, I started college, this book actually speaks a lot. What really is powerful about this book, what really spoke to me, is the way they talk about loneliness and being sad, and how like trauma can deeply affect that as well. Because both Nayoko and Toru are sort of shaken up even years later by the suicide of Kazuki. And in a way that sort of makes them bond, and it has a weird romantic element to it. Well, at least on Toru's end. With Nayoko's end, it's a bit complicated. Now, obviously, I don't want to get into any spoilers. I just talked about the suicide thing because that's mentioned up front in like the summary about it, like when you read the back of the book. Well, let's talk about prose. What I really liked about this book. Again, I mentioned the loneliness and melancholy. The thing about Toru, the thing about him and his situation is that because of trauma, because of all the things, he closes himself off from other people. He sort of is distant. He becomes more introverted. So for those of you who feel introverted, not necessarily because of trauma, but just like introverted and not really much socializing, you can pretty much relate to a lot about what Toru's thinking and what Toru believes in with this. And in some ways, it also speaks a lot about people who are indifferent to like the world around them, not just like in terms of socialization, but in terms of like issues, like world issues, like global issues. Because the setting of the book takes place in 1960s. And as you know, in the 1960s, all throughout the world, not just in America, but in like Europe and like China, the 1960s saw a lot of unrest, specifically with student movements. So since this takes place in college, there are mentions of student movements, of activism. And Toru, he obviously becomes closed off because of that. He obviously becomes more isolated. Not I mean because of social movements, but because of the trauma as well. So it's really interesting how the book tackled that, and sort of talking to dig deeps about someone's own personal issues, mental health issues, and that can overcome their need to be more involved with the world around them, or even care about people around them. Like, take for instance, Nico. Because the thing about Nico, especially since she was so close to Kazuki, she has her own demon soul, and is actually suffering more than, say someone like Toru. Because it's like literally like almost a horrific situation, almost like there are little demons sort of inside her, like because of the suicide and because of her own like emotional torment. Like throughout the book, if you want to look for emotion, if you want to look for really pain and really like heartbreaking things, the best you can look for is with Naoko, because she is sort of like the emotional center of the novel. And I guess this in a little relates to Murakami's writing in total, because the thing with Murakami is because he's Japanese. Japanese people, or at least there's sort of a broad generalization, but like in East Asian cultures, like the family is priority, and the family affects like traditional life. So with Murakami, all his books are usually in like I form, right? Which is significant because that sort of removes the family, that focuses on the individual, both focus on their own free choices and sort of like their own sort of self-discovery in a way, which speaks a lot to Toru and his introvertedness and sort of like how he is. Another thing that I really want to talk about was sort of related to the trauma thing, but definitely depression. Because Naoko goes through a lot. She sees therapy, she sees people to help deal with her trauma or deal with her therapy. And yet, a lot of the time, she's not really gotten better because of it. Whereas Toru sort of is in the same boat, or at least he somewhat is not as affected by the trauma, but he still suffers a lot. Who doesn't really go to therapy, who doesn't really do these sorts of things. Yet his outcome is sort of better. So I guess in a way, the book was sort of making a statement about how different people can experience trauma in different ways, which is kind of obvious. But it's also how, like, even if you get help, you might not be better off than someone who doesn't get help, or someone who does get help. Which, in a weird way, is both pessimistic and optimistic at the same time. But because of these traumas, because of these like sort of feelings of negativity, a big thing is communication. Naoko and Tori, they do not communicate at all. Not necessarily because of the trauma that went into Kazuki's death, but also because just how they are as people. Because as mentioned previously, that Naoko and Toru had not interacted at all prior to. Because of this lack of communication, Naoko and Toru right off the bat don't really know each other all that well. And while admittedly they have conversations, how they truly feel, or like who they truly are, is never really fully explored by the other. And not just with them. There are other characters, such as Nagasawa, who is one of Toru's doormates. He has struggled communicating with his girlfriend Hatsumi, because he is a bit of a player, type character. And so there's always weird friction between the both of them, or at least Hatsumi doesn't really talk about her feelings much with Nagasawa. And throughout the novel, we see this idea of honesty, this idea of telling the truth about being yourself, right? But with people like Toru and Naoko, who they are as people is being quiet, is being shy, is being reserved. So it's almost like they're being themselves, but that inadvertently hurts the people around them in the way they talk with each other. Naoko, I'm not going to spoil much, as I mentioned before, but Naoko has a foil in Midori, a classmate of Toru's. Now it's interesting because Midori and Toru don't sort of have a thing. They don't really have sort of a thing. They do not have a thing. But Midori by far is completely different from Naoko in that she's more outgoing, she's more open, she's more upfront. Yet in a way, she's also hiding her own secrets, and she's sort of not as communicative as one would expect from someone who's as honest as upward as Midori. And then we have to talk at least a little bit about the sex with Norwegian Wood. It's interesting because the way Murakami writes his sex scenes, like they're not like gratuitous, they're not like super erotic, they're not also like really gross. They're just really simple, I guess. They're just really plain and open, which is really different from how the characters talk to each other. And in a way, it's the way he writes it is sort of like people acknowledging each other, like their bodies and what they're doing, in a way that's not really spoken by the characters, or really even thought by the characters per se, but just like the way Murakami writes it, if that makes sense. And furthermore, it sort of talks about like society, or at least how we view sex, something as either really sacred between two people who like each other, or something awkward between two people who don't know each other, or something as meaningless and as cheap as like Nagasawa and One Night Stands. Now, outside the sex scenes, the way Murakami writes is like really beautiful because it's like a surrealist, sort of really not necessarily like descriptive per se. He keeps it simple, but like through his words, you could get a lot of emotion, a lot of feeling, a lot of, you get a lot of the loneliness, the melancholy that I previously described in the book, and that the characters Toru, Naoko, Hatsumi, everyone feels like that loneliness, that sadness. Especially since, I'm in college, or I just started college, and there are a lot of people who are going to college. This idea about loneliness and being by yourself, I feel like is really, really helpful for people like that, of that demographic. Now, in terms of cons, what I will say is that if you like books with plot, with a lot of action, with a lot of drama, with a lot of stuff like that, then definitely Norwegian Wood is not for you, or at least Murakami. Some of his books aren't for you. And I will say at times it does get confusing. Although by far Norwegian Wood is definitely like most easiest to get through work, at least his most modern novels. A lot of the other novels are super confusing, sort of like abstract in a way, because you have weird images juxtaposing each other and like weird descriptions and stuff like that. Also, the ending, in a way, there's some parts of the ending that might make you weirded out or grossed out, or not necessarily grossed out, but just like confused. Because I will admit, there are some parts of the end which I didn't really like, and I thought could have been handled better. I was not going to spoil it, just like as a heads up. But besides that, I don't really have much to complain about from Murakami, because it's not so much like what he says, it's like the beauty of it, and like about the characters, and like their own little world, and like the struggle with that. And especially if you know someone's struggling with mental health, like depression, anxiety, if you know someone who is at least or like introverted, or is not as clear as communicating their ideas, or it's people who want to get involved, or are too caught up in like their own personal problems, regardless if they have mental health issues or not. Norwegian Wood speaks to a lot of people, and it really makes you think about you, especially when you're entering college, or especially when you're entering the adolescent age. So, yeah, as you like to say, drink your cider and roll. Thank you.